Good morning. Let's begin. What?
Do you ever watch on YouTube? It's this woman called Melissa Dougherty.
Yeah,
Oh, you do?
I
Okay.
subscribe to her
Oh, okay.
channel.
Because I saw that and I was like, oh, she talks about that all the time.
Yeah, in fact, she just wrote a book, but it's not out yet. But it's about that subject.
I remember seeing her video where she was like, I said I never was going to do it, but I wrote a book, guys.
Yeah, no, that's one of the ones I subscribe to. Good morning. So we've been discussing worldviews, and in particular, our concern is not to survey every worldview of every religion and philosophy and so on in the whole world, but to look at the things that are most relevant to the church in America, the kinds of things where, in subtle ways, especially if a non-Christian worldview were to kind of bleed into the church and influence our thinking from the culture around us. Now, today, we're going to look at something that starts out seeming way out there. Like, how could this possibly have anything to do with the church? And over the next 2 weeks, we're going to see that actually televangelists, for example, that you've heard of, who are well known and popular, have been influenced by these ideas, bizarre as they are. They've filtered down into churches. New Thought movement. You might have heard of the New Age movement. People talk about that. That's somewhat distantly related and more recent. This is something from the 1800s that is still influential today. And where does it all start? Well, I told you we're going to be way out there. It starts out with Hinduism. In the early 19th century, some of the Hindu scriptures, the Hindu holy books, got translated into English for the first time, and they captured the imagination of certain writers in America, for example, and the ideas that they seized on, we'll define them later, primarily Maya, that's the one we're going to be concerned with most. It's a Hindi word. Karma, you've probably heard of karma before, and monism. And we'll look at these as they come up in context of their influences on American Christianity. Not all of these things had equal effect on Christian thinkers at the time. But the first effect in America of this Hindu exposure was a movement called Transcendentalism. There was a group of authors who were often referred to as the New England Transcendentalists. They were all from New England. Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden. Civil Disobedience was a famous essay of his, which influenced Mahatma Gandhi back in India in the 20th century. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet Walt Whitman, whose most famous poetry work was called Leaves of Grass, and it's a popular poetry book. These were all among the first to pick up on Hindu ideas, starting in the 1830s. Transcendentalism is often traced to a public address, I believe it was actually one of those graduation speeches at a college, by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836. And one of the ideas that Emerson seized upon was the idea of karma, the idea that everything that you've done in the past comes back to influence you in the rest of your life. Now, in Hinduism, karma is actually tied to the idea of reincarnation. It's what you do in this life helps determine what happens in your next life, after you get reincarnated as a new being. And it helps determine what kind of being you get reincarnated in. But in the American imagination, since Emerson didn't believe in reincarnation, he picked up on this idea of karma and applied it just within this life. He wrote an essay called Compensation, which was what he termed karma. Now, another idea that affected the transcendentalists was this monism, or pantheistic monism. Pantheism is the idea that as opposed to having a separate God and then the creation, the creator and the creation, that basically God is simply the sum total of the creation. God in Hinduism is not necessarily a personal God who's separate from his creation, but rather everything is God. This is one of the central ideas of the so-called New Age movement that's more recently. But this monism idea says instead of splitting things into good, evil, creator, creation, reality, and illusion, even God versus me. Instead, the idea of Eastern religions, of the pantheistic monism, is that there's only oneness. Now, this idea, you might say, if I wanted to really, really oversimplify the difference between the New Thought movement and the New Age movement, is that the New Age movement in more recent years really focuses on monism, really focuses on everything being of one origin, which of course, in the biblical worldview, God exists before there's any creation. He's separate from his creation. His creation is created by him, but it's not part of his nature. So this is totally incompatible with the biblical worldview. God is perfect. His creation can be fallen. His creation can go off with free will and be imperfect. We don't have the same exact nature as God just because we're created in the image of God. But this monism idea is central to the New Age movement of the 20th and 21st centuries. For example, to take a popular example, in the 1970s, we began with the first of the Star Wars movies. And in the Star Wars, one of the important concepts is the Force, right? The Force. Well, what is the Force? Well, George Lucas, who was the inventor of the Star Wars movies, was very much into the New Age movement, and he was into monism. And so the Force is always explained in the Star Wars movies as something that's inherent to everything, and good and bad are not separate. They're two aspects of the Force, right? There's the dark side and the good side. And believe it or not, a lot of people who were part of the New Age movement really latched on to those Star Wars movies, and they really were into the monism of it, the idea that the Force is, real, and that it's both good and bad are united together in it. They're not separate, really. And then in 1999, after those first three Star Wars movies came out, and George Lucas had announced at the time, I've got a whole 9-episode sequence planned out. And this is actually, these first three movies are really 4, 5, and 6 in the sequence. And so we'll get around to 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll get around to 7, 8, and 9 later. In 1999, they finally got out to, more than 20 years after the first Star Wars movie, they finally got around to episode 1 called The Phantom Menace. And in episode 1, they took a turn and they said, the Force is based on these little organisms that live inside every cell in the universe. They're called midichlorians. And the little boy in episode 1 who was Anakin Skywalker, who was going to become the next Jedi and all that, they looked at his blood under a microscope and said, wow, look how many midichlorians he has, you know. The New Age fans of the Star Wars series were very upset at this movie because the Force, to them, was a spiritual thing. It was an Eastern religious thing, and now it's been turned into a physical thing. And they were actually very upset at this turn in the movie. You've turned it into just a little particle, you know, a organism inside every cell. That's not Hinduism anymore. That's just not New Age anymore, and they were quite disappointed in it. But the Transcendentalists seized upon this monism, incorporated it into their thinking. But then came the key concept that from Hinduism that really is what we're going to focus on, which is illusion versus reality. There's a lot of complexity in Hinduism. There's different kinds of Hinduism. One of the main kinds is called Vedanta Hinduism. But the Vedanta Hindu concept of Maya, that's one of those terms that we're going to explain that I mentioned earlier. This concept is the key to really to understanding the big influence that Hinduism had in the Western world. Maya is really just the word that means illusion. But in particular, this Hindu belief is that the entire material world is an illusion of our minds. It's just the creation of our minds. It's just an illusion. Now, that's kind of a tough sell to most Westerners, wouldn't you suppose? That, you know, telling me that none of this is real, it's all why are we all imagining the same thing then? You know, why do we all see the same pews if it's my imagination? And why is it we have scientific experiments that you can repeat with chemicals and so on if it's all an illusion? Why does it get the same result every time? Well, to a Western way of thinking, this is just completely bizarre. And so it's not in itself a very popular idea in the West. But there have been numerous attempts made to integrate this idea into Christianity. First example, the Christian Science Church. There was a man named P.P. Quimby, Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, another New Englander who was reading these Hindu texts. And he came up with the idea that based on the Hindu idea of Maya, and really a lot of the Asian religions are very concerned with the idea of suffering. You know, how to escape the cycle of suffering. They have a cyclical view, which is where reincarnation comes from, but how do you escape the cycle and suffer less and less? And one of the ideas is, well, the suffering is in your mind. It's bad thinking that's causing your suffering. That's from the Maya concept. Quimby developed the idea that all physical suffering, all pain, disease, whatever, is caused by bad thinking. And so he engaged in mentally trying to treat people and using hypnotism and so on, and he tried to treat patients for their ailments. And one lady who had had a lot of physical problems in her life was named Mary Baker Eddy. And she went on to found Christian Science. She proclaimed at the time that she had been mentally healed by P.P. Quimby. Later, she started hiding the influence that Quimby had upon her. claiming that all of her ideas came directly from God to her. But it's been pretty well documented. You can see side by side what he said and what she said, that it's direct influence and in some cases plagiarism. And there's outright word for word plagiarism that she took from another of Quimby's students. So the Christian Science Church, which by the way, the official name is Church of Christ, Scientist, actually teaches the Maya concept directly. Now that's unusual because, like I said, that's a pretty tough sell with the Western mind. And so what we're going to see is that most of the influence of Hinduism in the Western world does not come from teaching explicitly that the material world is an illusion, because you just can't get very many people to believe that. Most of it involves teaching about mental healing, skipping over the foundation, which is that the material world's an illusion, it's all in your mind, kind of skipping right past that to the next step, which is all of your suffering is caused by your bad thinking. If you engaged in more positive thinking, the suffering would go away, and so on. Not explaining the basis for that belief. But in Christian Science, it's explicitly taught matter is mortal error. One of my brothers married a Christian Science woman. And I remember, and she had a little decoration on their daughter's bedroom wall that said, matter is mortal error. Matter itself is an error in human thinking. This is explicitly taught in Christian Science. You might have heard about Christian scientists refusing medical treatment. And then sometimes there are court cases. Can a hospital force this injured person to accept treatment? Where do we draw the line between religious liberty and, care for people? Can we force someone to take treatment against their beliefs? So there have been legal cases. Why do they refuse medical treatment in so many cases? Because they think that only their bad thinking has gotten them this problem, and if they just change their thinking, they'll cure themselves. And accepting the medical treatment is like a lack of faith. Well, yeah, it is. It's very... Well, it's like one of the authors I read, he was very dispassionate talking about this, but he got to the end of his chapter on Christian Science, and he said, he kind of got exasperated and said, so, Christian scientists get out of their imaginary bed in the morning and put on their imaginary clothes and get in their imaginary car and drive off to an imaginary building where they have a job, I mean, it's really incomprehensible to most of us how you can live this way and believe this at the same time. It's very, very strange. And of course, obviously, Maya simply can't be reconciled with the Bible because we have thousands of passages that depend upon physical world events to have any meaning. Most obviously, what? The crucifixion and the bodily resurrection and so on. But the creation of God, what did he create? If he didn't create the material world, if that's all our imagination, then what is the creation story? But so you really can't reconcile any of this with Christianity. And yet, Mary Baker Eddy wrote the foundational book for Christian Science, which is called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, in which she goes through Bible passages and basically explains why they don't mean what they obviously mean. It's one of those bizarre kind of things. That verse doesn't really mean what you seem to think it means. That kind of thing. But this is all coming out of a broad movement called New Thought. And most of the New Thought, once again, doesn't depend on teaching that the material world is an illusion. It skips right to the next step. It's very focused on mental healing. The New Thought movement of the late 1800s is focused only on the healing part of it, not on the reason that you can supposedly mentally heal yourself. They skip right over the direct teaching of Maya, with a few exceptions like Christian Science. Now, Quimby influenced other leaders, and if you look him up, he's considered the founder of New Thought in America. And the key here is, and one of the big differences between New Thought and New Age, for the most part, the New Age movement of the late 20th century and the 21st century isn't focused on Christianity. It's not trying to integrate itself into Christianity with a few exceptions. It's really not have the same focus. But New Thought in the 19th century was trying to integrate these Hindu ideas into Christianity. The Christian Science Church, the Unity School of Christianity, the Church of Religious Science, what's called the mind sciences. These were attempts to blend Christianity with the mental healing from Maya. Now, this brings a little bit of deja vu. We talked in the past about the problem of matter versus spirit dualism, and how going back to Plato at least, there's this idea that the material world was inherently bad, and only the spiritual world could be good. And, of course, that would make it impossible for God to become incarnate as Jesus Christ. If the physical world's inherently evil, then God couldn't become incarnate. And when this kind of dualism became influential in the late first century, a heresy arose that we talked about, which was that Jesus was just a spirit. He didn't really have a body. That's how they got around if the material world is totally evil. And that's why in 1 John, we find that John is warning against these heretics. 1 John chapter 4. He says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to determine if they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." Well, what false prophets is he concerned with? He continues, "This is how you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit who confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, but every spirit who does not confess Jesus has come in the flesh is not from God. This is the spirit of Antichrist. You have heard that he is coming, and he's already in the world now." So John identifies this heresy of dualism with the spirit of Antichrist. Because you can't have an incarnate Son of God if the physical world, including all of our bodies, is inherently evil, can you? But the reason this is a little deja vu is that the other angle to come from is if you say that the material world doesn't even exist, it's just an illusion of our minds, well then God can't become incarnate then either, can he? So the incarnation is impossible either way. What did New Thought produce starting in the 19th century? Well, some of the New Thought leaders actually established new churches that tried to integrate Christianity with Hindu concepts. We already mentioned Christian Science, which has the explicit Hindu Maya concept and the mental healing concept. You'll notice mental healing is common to all this. The Unity School of Christianity mixes all kinds of Eastern religions, transcendentalism philosophies, mental healing, and Christianity, and in particular the belief in reincarnation. There's a unity, they tend to be called Unity Church. There's a Unity Church in Charlottesville. If you go over on Hydraulic and go right past Albemarle High, on your left, about a block up, there's a little Unity School, Unity Church. And yeah, they teach a form of Christianity. They also teach reincarnation and so on. They try to blend those together, even though I don't see how they could be compatible. Church of Religious Science, I don't think exists much outside of California where it was started, but that's the one that tries to blend Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, philosophical ideas, and of course, mental healing. Especially, of course, reincarnation. What did the author of Hebrews say in Hebrews 9:27? It is given to a man to die once, and then comes the judgment. You only get to die once, and then you're transported to the judgment day. And reincarnation cannot be made compatible with such a teaching. So, our concern, however, isn't primarily those little churches, small as they are, Christian Science, Unity Church, Church of Religious Science. What we're really concerned with is that the ideas of mental healing got Christianized by people who explicitly were influenced by New Thought teachers. And so you have Christian preachers, and you can't paint all the faith healers with one brush, but there's a subset of them that we're going to see the next couple of weeks who picked up on this basic idea that if you just thought positively, if you just stopped your bad thinking, all of your ailments would go away. And that persists to today, to famous preachers today. And we're going to see over the next 2 weeks the explicit genealogy of somebody says, well, I learned from this other Christian preacher, and you can see that their language is the same. And that older Christian preacher says, well, I learned from this man who wrote in the early 1900s, and you go examine what he wrote, and he was directly influenced by New Thought writers and was quoting or even plagiarizing them. So the genealogy is pretty clear. But most of the people who are exposed to this Christian teaching, of course, don't know anything about the origin of it. And what can people do? They can always take Bible verses and twist them to sound kind of like something else. And so the people who follow these televangelists and so on would be angry to hear the suggestion that this all comes from Hinduism. No, it doesn't. I've listened to this guy. He doesn't ever talk about Hinduism. He quotes from the Bible. Yeah. And you can show that he was influenced by this guy directly, who was influenced by this guy who was caught up in New Thought back in the late 1800s. And that's where the interpretations of certain Christian preachers on how you can heal yourself through your power of your mind and your faith came from. We'll take a look at that starting next week. Thank you.